So, as we begin the criticisms against cultural relativism, remember that cultural relativism is not simply the idea that each culture has different morals. It includes the controversial idea that each culture is correct about its fundamental moral beliefs because morality is simply cultural acceptance. Notice, too, that cultural relativism is not the idea that the right answer varies from situation to situation. While it includes that, it's also the deeper idea that a practice is right simply because a culture endorses it and wrong simply because a culture forbids it. We are not simply saying it's right to lie in some cases and wrong in others. Cultural relativism implies the culture determines whether and when it is right to lie. But is cultural relativism correct? Does morality depend entirely on culture? And this belief in cultural relativism, will it help you live a better life, or will following it harm you? Okay, so the first criticism against cultural relativism is that it makes anything right as long as a culture approves of it. And so there's a sense of moral infallibility, or this oversimplification of morality. Now, you can understand the first criticism by asking this question. Are slavery, rape, honor killings, FGM, child abuse, genocide, are these right if a culture approves of them? The answer is yes if cultural relativism is true. So under cultural relativism, these evils are right in culture A simply because culture A approves of them. And they are wrong in culture B simply because culture B disapproves of them. So the problem with cultural relativism is that it can make anything right. Cultural relativism implies cultures are morally infallible at a foundational or at some level, and this oversimplifies morality and the nature of your conscience. So the bottom line is that little angel on your shoulder, your conscience, tells you that slavery, rape, child abuse, and genocide are wrong, no matter where they occur or when they occur. And this is a problem for cultural relativism because relativism implies these acts are right in cultures that endorse them. Now remember, when arguing for cultural relativism, people often use the examples of how people in different cultures eat, dress, or show respect to the dead. And you probably believe how people in diverse cultures dress, eat, and treat the dead is relative. But can you really believe that slavery, rape, genocide, and child abuse are good simply because the majority in a culture endorse them? If not, you are not really a cultural relativist. Your conscience is more complex, interesting, and older than your culture, even though your culture may nurture or neglect your conscience. So to summarize, the first problem with cultural relativism is that cultural approval of evil acts does not make those acts good. And this criticism is not simply the idea that we don't like the absurd implications of cultural relativism. It's also the idea that these absurd implications show that cultural relativism has oversimplified the nature of morality and your conscience. As Dostoevsky, Socrates, and many great thinkers have argued, there is something deeper at work in morality, something rooted in your conscience. It's like a seed planted beneath the surface of any culture. While culture can shape how that seed grows, nourishing it or letting it wither, the seed itself is already there. So as we explore the criticisms against relativism, we'll begin to uncover more clearly what this seed of conscience really is, what morality might truly be. Okay, let's move to the second criticism against cultural relativism. And as you think about these criticisms, you always, in the back of your mind, want to be thinking, okay, if I'm not judging based on some culturally relative criteria, what criteria am I using? All right, so the second criticism against cultural relativism is a criticism of the cultural differences argument, which was the idea that because different cultures hold different moral beliefs, there can be no objective standard of right and wrong. So the first problem with this argument is the conclusion is not logically supported by the premises. Even if it's true that different cultures have different moral codes, this doesn't mean that there are no objective moral truths. So James Rachels explains it like this. Imagine a different matter. In some societies, people believe the earth is flat. In other societies, such as our own, people believe the earth is roughly spherical. Does it follow from the mere fact that people disagree that there's no objective truth in geography? Of course not. We would never draw such a conclusion because we realize that in their beliefs about the world, the members of some societies, some cultures, might simply be wrong. There's no reason to think that if the world is round, everyone must know it. In a similar way, there's no reason to think that if there is a moral truth, then everyone must know it. So the fundamental mistake in the cultural differences argument is that it attempts to derive a substantive conclusion about a subject from the mere fact that people disagree about it. Now, this is a simple point of logic, Rachel explains, and it's important not to misunderstand it. We are not saying, not yet anyway, we're not saying that the conclusion of the argument is false, the conclusion being it's all relative, right? It's still an open question whether the conclusion is true or false. The logical point is just that the conclusion does not follow from the premise. And this is important because in order to determine whether the conclusion is true, we need arguments in its support. The cultural differences argument turns out to be fallacious, though, so it proves nothing. The cultural differences argument is like saying, again, some people think the earth is flat, some think it's round, so clearly it's complicated. Right? Now notice too that it misses the point to say geography or empirical claims are very different from moral claims, because it's not the content but the form of the argument that's fallacious. And this is an important point in logic. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy also gives you this example to think about. Cultures have different sporting preferences. Brazilians love soccer, Pakistanis prefer cricket, Mongolians are passionate about horse racing, but no one would suggest that these differences are explained by the absence of a single objectively superior game that everyone should play. Okay, so this criticism should bring up many other ideas in your mind. Even if diversity proves little logically, is it not at least suggestive of relativism? That is, if there's a deeper reason for relativism, then the relativist could use apparent cultural differences to reinforce some stronger argument, even though the cultural differences argument alone is logically fallacious. And the relativist may also ask, if some moral claims are objective, then how do we demonstrate their objective truth? It's very weird to say moral claims are objective to some people. So we'll address these concerns as we proceed, but I think it's obvious that the cultural differences argument fails to strongly support moral relativism on its own. So the third criticism against cultural relativism is one that you'll find in almost every introductory ethics textbook. And the criticism is that the ideas of progress and regress just don't make sense if relativism is true, because we can't say things are really better or worse, only that they're different. The ideas of moral progress and regress just don't make sense if morality is relative. So James Rachels explains the idea of progress here. He says, usually we think that at least some social changes are for the better, although of course other changes may be for the worse. So throughout most of Western history, the place of women in society was narrowly circumscribed. They could not own property, they could not vote or hold political office, and generally they were under the almost absolute control of their husbands, is what James Rachels argues. Now, recently, much of this has changed, and most people think of it as progress. But if cultural relativism is correct, can we legitimately think of this as progress? Progress means replacing a way of doing things with a better way. But by what standard do we judge the new ways as better? If the old ways were in accordance with the social standards of the time, then cultural relativism would say it's a mistake to judge them by the standards of a different time. So 18th century society was in effect a different society from the one we have now. To say that we have made progress implies a judgment that present day society is better in some ways, and that judgment is just the sort of transcultural judgment that, according to cultural relativism, is impermissible. Now, G.K. Chesterton, he was a great author, one of my favorites, but he made a similar point long ago. He said that if there are no stable standards across cultures and times, then progress and regress make no sense. He wrote that progress should mean that we are always changing the world to suit the vision, rather than constantly changing the vision to suit what is currently popular in the world. So Chesterton gives the example of a race to illustrate. If the official keeps moving the finish line, then no runner will ever reach it. The act of racing becomes meaningless if the standard we race towards is relative and can change. So progress, as well as regress, progress presupposes a stable finish line. We could imagine a ship, too, that can never make progress because it continually changes its destination. And while there may be multiple routes to reach a fixed destination, and some routes that lead to disaster, the idea of progress and regress requires a fixed destination, a summum bonum. So, another example, every part of a machine has parts that move and at least one part that does not move. So, in short, the claim is that It's logically absurd to believe in moral progress while simultaneously believing that different cultures and times have radically or fundamentally different moral values. So there must be a stable standard, a finish line or destination, a summum bonum, for there to be progress or regress. And so if you're progressive in any sense, you cannot simultaneously be a relativist. Now again, as you think about these criticisms against cultural relativism, always in the back of your mind be thinking, well, what is this universal or transcultural criteria by which I can judge? And maybe one of those criterion is it's wrong to cause unnecessary suffering and it's good to reduce it. All right, let's move to the next criticism. Now, the fourth criticism of cultural relativism is very similar to the third. Most ethics textbooks call it the moral reformer criticism. They argue that if cultural relativism is true, then moral reformers within each culture would always be wrong because they disagree with their culture and some fundamental moral values. So examples of moral reformers are like the abolitionists in the 19th century, or Frederick Douglass, or Martin Luther King Jr. in the 20th century, or good old Socrates. There are moral reformers in every culture and every time. And in a different part of this course, we'll learn about one woman from the Gambia who's a moral reformer. She's trying to change the moral opinions and the laws in her country and her culture about FGM, female genital mutilation. But consider this quote from another modern moral reformer. Her name is Mona Olatahawi. She writes, "When Westerners remain silent out of respect for so-called foreign cultures, they show support only for the most conservative elements of those cultures. Cultural relativism is as much my enemy as the oppression I fight within my own culture and faith." So take a moment and let that sink in. Moral reformers in the Middle East are risking their lives to protect human dignity and reduce unnecessary suffering. And she says that relativism and so-called tolerance are just as much her enemy as the oppression she faces at home. She understands the real-world implications of relativism and so rejects it. So will you side with her or the majority in her culture? Will you side with her or try not to judge her oppression as wrong simply because another culture or person endorses it? So the problem with cultural relativism is it encourages you to side with the majority in her culture, since relativism implies there's no valid way to judge another culture's values. And we often hear, who are you to judge? But perhaps when it comes to FGM, slavery, rape, genocide, and other evils, we should ask, who are you not to judge? Just be clear on the criteria you are using to judge, and then judge away. Judge other cultural practices as well as your own. Now, what criteria? We always want to ask that question. What criteria are you using to judge? You want to make sure it's universal, and I'm going to keep pushing that point. But one of the criteria is, does it cause unnecessary suffering? Another is, does it show respect and human dignity, right? So in short, this criticism against cultural relativism is it cannot account for moral reformers who challenge the fundamental moral beliefs of a culture. And so cultural relativism is not a sufficient description of your conscience or morality. The problem is relativism implies moral reformers are wrong when disagreeing with their fundamental moral values of their culture, but they aren't always wrong. So there must instead be something false about cultural relativism. So the fifth criticism against cultural relativism is that it doesn't really support tolerance like a lot of people think. Let's see why. Let's begin by defining tolerance not as accepting all views, but as the willingness to allow the existence of opinions or behavior that you don't necessarily agree with. After all, it requires no tolerance to accept views you already agree with. True tolerance is shown when we allow views we find disagreeable. Accepting views you already agree with, it's like agreeing with yourself out loud, or hanging out with your fan club, or hanging out in your internet bubble instead of people who might actually disagree with you, like your family. So with this clearer understanding of what tolerance means, we can now explore its relationship to relativism. First, it's important to recognize that one can be a relativist and still be intolerant. So if a culture promotes intolerance or closed-mindedness, as is the case in the Nazis or the Taliban, cultural relativism would imply that those intolerant values are just as valid as any others. Or if I'm an individual relativist, I can adopt intolerance, because according to individual relativism or subjectivism, intolerance is good as long as I sincerely adopt it and accept intolerance. Therefore, both forms of moral relativism can easily justify intolerance. At the same time, relativism also seems to encourage tolerance, according to a lot of people, since it holds that all cultural values are equally valid, making it psychologically easier for some to accept different perspectives as valid. So, in short, my point, though, is that relativism is not the same as tolerance. In fact, it can be used to not simply cause, but also justify intolerance. So you may not know this, but my culture that I was raised in tells me to hate redheaded people and to kill kittens. They're intolerant of those. But I'm not a cultural relativist, so don't worry. I believe some cultural values are just flat out wrong. Okay, so a deeper problem with equating relativism and tolerance is that it often leads to a contradiction. When relativists claim that everyone should be tolerant, they are making a universal moral statement, thus the word everyone. But those statements, universal statements, are something that relativism, by definition, rejects. Relativism holds that there are no objective or universal moral standards, so insisting that everyone adopt tolerance undermines the relativistic position. In contrast, a moral objectivist, that is a non-relativist, can more coherently defend the claim that everyone should be tolerant because objectivists accept that some moral principles may apply universally. So this kind of internal inconsistency or contradiction is a common and serious challenge for all kinds of relativism, not simply the cultural or moral forms of relativism. In practice, many relativists still hold strong moral beliefs that implicitly assume some objective standards, and that reveals a tension between their philosophical stance, relativism, and their actual moral commitments. So again, the problem is relativists hold beliefs that contradict relativism, as if I say, none of my parents' children survived, or this sentence is false. Or in cognitive relativism, you have the problem involved with saying, all claims are relative, and that's a problem because the claim that all claims are relative would itself be relative. Okay, so that was the second issue. Now the third issue is from Jonathan Wolfe, and he has argued that many people confuse relativism with liberalism. So liberalism calls for the toleration or even encouragement of diverse ways of living, but liberalism, in calling for tolerance as a universal value, contradicts relativism because relativism implies there are no universal values. So Wolfe's point is that liberalism too contradicts relativism, though some people superficially use liberalism and relativism interchangeably. Now you can also, in addition to these criticisms, you can look out the world and look at people who think of themselves as relativists. You'll find intolerant ones as well as tolerant ones, right? Okay, so the bottom line is I have outlined three major reasons for why cultural relativism should not be associated with tolerance, since it also supports intolerance. In fact, in my opinion, it seems to me that relativism more strongly supports intolerance, since it grounds morality in cultural or individual approval, which can change from day to day and it's hard to argue with. Now, since we're on the topic, so the next criticism against cultural relativism addresses the God issue. Remember, one argument for relativism was that God is dead, so morality is relative, not objective or absolute. The simple reply here is God is not dead. Billions of people believe in some kind of God that is the source of morality. Now, let me clarify this, especially for those of you who believe God exists. The criticism against relativism is your belief in God contradicts moral relativism. It's logically inconsistent to believe both that some form of relativism is true and that God is the ultimate source of morality, because this belief in God means morality is grounded in God, not human culture, not consensus, not personal feelings. The theist believes that individuals, cultures, and even entire religions can be morally mistaken if their values conflict with God's will. So consider this example. Suppose my culture and I sincerely believe that torturing kittens for fun is morally good. If this act is wrong in God's eyes, then we are simply mistaken. Its wrongness isn't relative to our approval. It is fixed by God's standard or God's nature. No amount of cultural agreement or individual choice can make it morally right. Now, students sometimes think religion is relativistic because there are so many religions. But this does not follow because a God-based morality implies that even your religion can be mistaken about what God commands. For example, if your religion endorses torturing redheads, but God forbids it, then your religion is wrong on that point. Neither you nor your religion can make torturing redheads good. Again, the belief in God contradicts cultural relativism because God is the standard by which to judge all cultural practices, and this is true even if you are not sure what God commands. Relativism, on the other hand, maintains the ultimate judge is culture, or individual persons. Now, one deep discussion this leads to is metaphysics, or what the world ultimately is. And it also leads to metaethics, which is about the ontological or metaphysical status of values. What are values? Now, I'll save that deep and interesting discussion for a later video. For now, I'll simply say that if God is the source of morality and existence, then the source of morality is not unconscious matter or energy. The foundation of reality is instead a consciousness and love that some people call God. This would have many consequences for the nature of morality, and it would have consequences for why one should be moral. Because becoming moral would involve aligning yourself with the heart, the foundation of reality, and so becoming more real. Whereas if it's just unconscious matter all the way down, when you become moral, you're just aligning with your preferences, not the heart of reality. At least that is one way of seeing it to bring about more discussion and debate. But that's another discussion. For now, the criticism of the God argument is that many people, and this may include you, do not believe God is dead. God is the ultimate standard, not your culture. So the belief in God usually contradicts relativism. Okay, the next criticism is straightforward. How do you know what is right when your cultures conflict? The problem is you belong to many cultures, and so it's problematic to base morality solely on your culture. So consider this example. Some students are members of pop, Catholic, and American culture. So how do they decide what is right when their Catholic and American culture conflict on abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, slavery, euthanasia, or other moral issues? Cultural relativism is no help because it claims morality is cultural, but it does not tell you which of your cultures to follow. Now, let's imagine that you are a member of two different cultures that disagree on slavery. What process do you use to determine which of your cultures is correct? If you can identify this process, it will reveal something important about morality and your conscience. When you reflect on this process, you'll see that your conscience disagrees with slavery in all cultures because your conscience is trying to reduce unnecessary suffering and do more. It follows that part of the hidden moral standard in your moral judgments is the attempt to reduce unnecessary suffering. You are not simply following cultural norms, but are instead using the standard of reducing suffering to judge all cultural norms, including your own. In short, this criticism suggests that cultural relativism is an unclear guide to the good life because it cannot help you when your cultures conflict, but it's also a poor description of your conscience and morality, which seeks to reduce suffering and more instead of merely following cultural norms. Again, your conscience has roots that are much older than any culture. A lot of people are drawn to moral relativism because they don't understand there are many alternatives, but there are many. Here are some. The first alternative is natural law theory, which is the idea that morality is grounded in human nature and can be discovered through reason. So look at Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle for that. A second alternative to moral relativism is divine command theory, or religion in general, because it bases morality on God instead of individual or cultural approval, and so it's not moral relativism. A third alternative is deontology, like Immanuel Kant's form of deontology, which bases morality on rationality, pure reason, and the categorical imperative. And it's not relativism because moral laws are universal and binding for all rational beings. Now, a fourth alternative to moral relativism is another form of deontology by W.D. Ross. It's a form of intuitionism that avoids Kant's absolutism. A fifth alternative to moral relativism is utilitarianism, which bases morality on achieving the consequence of net happiness. That's the standard by which you can make all moral judgments, whether you're judging your own culture or that of another. Now, another alternative is Ayn Rand's objectivism. She bases morality on rational, objective self-interest instead of individual approval or cultural approval and consensus. And as you look at all these alternatives, it's important to remember that they're not all theistic, right? There's many atheistic alternatives as well. For example, Sam Harris, a famous atheist, adopts the position like moral realism or utilitarianism, where he claims that moral facts exist and can be scientifically or rationally known. So Harris argues that morality relates to human well-being, and it's not relativism because it holds that some moral claims are objectively true or false. Now, we could go on. I could mention moral Platonism. So G.E. Moore and Plato have this idea that moral truths exist independently of human minds, like mathematical truths, and that's not relativism. I could tell you about contractarianism. So figures like Thomas Hobbes, John Rawls, and T.M. Scanlon present the idea of social contracts. So morality arises from hypothetical or actual social contracts that rational agents would agree to. And that's not relativism because it aims for principles that rational agents would universally endorse, not ones that differ by society. There's other alternatives too, but the purpose of this video is just to help you see that there are alternatives, both theistic and atheistic, for you to consider. And perhaps the key is to see that morality may be grounded in reason, a shared human nature, an axiomatic value, or God. Moral truths can be grounded in something deeper than individual approval or cultural approval and consensus.